The young boy, Mark, waking up to find a cake on his table. He takes a bite but is distracted by an unusual noise coming from the wall. Suddenly, his father, Carl, appears and urgently pulls him away. Carl tells Mark and his brother, Thomas, that they need to leave immediately. He hands Thomas a chronicle, placing the responsibility on him to protect Mark. As they run out, Mark notices a frog standing upstairs, where it had previously been on the shelf. As they prepare to leave, their mother, Petra, tries to intervene. Desperate, she begs Carl, insisting that what he fears isn't real, and pleads for him to leave the children with her. However, Carl brushes past her without hesitation, driving off. A few years later, Mark is now 16. Mark finds his mother asleep on the living room sofa, gently adjusts her position, and heads off to school. Mark has a part-time job at a music shop where he distributes tapes to other students. At school, tensions rise when Mark has a confrontation with his teacher, who compares him to his older brother, calling him a troublemaker and reminding the class of how his brother once kicked him. Just as the situation is about to escalate, Becky, the new student, interrupts by introducing herself to the class, helping to diffuse the argument and shift the attention away from Mark. Later, Thomas surprises Mark at school with birthday wishes and takes him to the record store to celebrate. On the way, Mark suggests Thomas should check in on their mother, but Thomas dismisses the idea indifferently. When they arrive at the record store, Mark and Thomas find their friend Memo in an argument with the store owner. They quickly step in, help resolve the conflict, and get Memo out of the situation before grabbing the items they came for. Thomas then gives Mark the chronicle, explaining that their entire ancestor, including himself, has signed it. He urges Mark to take over their father's responsibility, emphasizing the importance of the Black Tower. Frustrated and skeptical, Mark expresses his distrust of both the book and their father. Despite his doubts, Mark signs the chronicle but remains conflicted. Afterward, he simply asks Thomas to come home with him, leaving the tension unresolved. Meanwhile, Becky feels uneasy. During a call, her mother reassures her to stick it out, reminding her it's only a matter of months. That evening, Petra grows anxious when Mark is over 30 minutes late. When he finally arrives and explains that Thomas had picked him up from school and would return the next day, her worry eases. Relieved, she hugs Mark tightly, her fears fading. Later that night, Mark opens the chronicle and begins exploring its pages. As he flips through, he becomes increasingly captivated, realizing the book is far more complex than he imagined. Suddenly, without warning, he vanishes and finds himself in a strange place, standing before a towering structure. Out of nowhere, a menacing creature called a slave hunter appears, chasing Mark. As he tries to escape, Mark falls into a pit, and just as the creature is about to strike him with an axe, he wakes up screaming. The next day at school, Becky is warned by a classmate, Sarah, to stay away from Mark, mentioning his temper and the trouble caused by his brother. Despite the warning, Becky abruptly leaves class and asks if he's all right, sparking a smooth connection between them. Mark visits his therapist, Petrus, for a regular checkup, having been in therapy for 3 years. Mark shares that he feels ready to move on and mentions his recent experience with the chronicle. Petrus attributes the visions to hallucinations, linking them to trauma from his father's death, and reassures Mark that these advances are part of his healing process. Later, Mark returns the chronicle to Thomas at the record store, insisting that Gryphons don't exist and dismissing them as hallucinations. Thomas, however, confidently promises that Mark will get proof that night. As Mark is leaving, he spots Becky at the record store. They end up spending time together on the rooftop, sharing food and talking. Becky opens up about her family, explaining how she was forced to live with her father under her mother's orders. When she asks about Mark's parents, he tells her his mother is a nurse, but downplays his father's role. They spend the evening dancing and listening to music, enjoying each other's company. Realizing he's late, Mark quickly gives Becky a tape before leaving off, leaving her on the rooftop. When Mark arrives home, he finds his mother and Thomas having a calm conversation. He joins them, but the mood shifts when Thomas becomes upset after their mother mentions something negative about their father. Frustrated, Thomas gets out. Determined to show Mark something, Thomas takes him to Angel's Rest Cemetery. Mark is uneasy, especially when Thomas leads him to a rooftop. Despite his fear of heights, Mark follows reluctantly, only because Thomas insists. On the rooftop, Thomas explains that since they signed the chronicle and embraced their father's legacy, they no longer need to fear heights. Thomas leads Mark to the gate of a nearby church and shows him some of their father's belongings. He hands Mark an empty box, explaining that they need to find the plumb bob. As Mark inspects the box, something inside pricks his finger, drawing blood. Suddenly, a hidden compartment opens, revealing mysterious lots. Thomas explains that the Gryphon, a powerful entity, needs their blood to sustain itself and rule the Black Tower. The lots, he says, are their weapon against it. Mark, however, dismisses his brother's explanation. But as Mark holds the lot, it reacts, almost as if it recognizes him. Suddenly, they notice a shadow and a stone statue appears to come to life. As they head back to the rooftop, another statue appears where none existed before. When they try to descend, a different statue attacks them. To their surprise, an angel statue intervenes, protecting them. They quickly seek shelter inside the church, but Mark is left in shock, unsure if what he saw was real or not. Mark wakes up from a terrifying dream, only to realize he's still inside the church. Noticing that Thomas is missing, he steps outside and sees the shattered remains of the stone statue that had attacked them the night before. The angelic statue, however, is back in its original place. Grateful for its protection, Mark quietly thanks the statue before heading to the record store to find Thomas. At the store, Thomas is nowhere to be found again, but Mark hears faint whispers coming from the Chronicle. Disturbed by the sounds, he quickly shuts the book and hides it in a cabinet, wanting to avoid whatever strange energy it holds. Meanwhile, Ben, one of Mark's classmates, has a tense encounter with his father, who accuses him of stealing money. His father becomes aggressive, nearly suffocating Ben in his rage, only to later find the money had fallen to the floor. Frustrated and hurt, Ben leaves the house and comes across Maya, another classmate, sitting on the stairs. Without saying much, he tells her he needs to get away, his troubled expression revealing emotion. Mark visits his therapist, Petrus, feeling increasingly unsettled. He shares that, although he can't see anything, he senses a presence and is fearful that Thomas is gone. Petrus tries to calm him with water and soothing words, advising Mark not to rely solely on therapy as a shield, but to face his problems head-on instead of running from them. During the session, Mark unexpectedly learns that Becky is Petrus's daughter, a revelation that surprises him. Meanwhile, Ben suggests to Sarah that they host a party at Schloss Park Cinema, thinking it's the perfect location. However, Sarah refuses to consider the idea, despite Ben's persistence. Back on his own, Mark dives deeper into the Chronicle's mysteries. As he examines a map within the book, he discovers several portal locations marked across it. While piecing things together, strange insects suddenly appear around him, and before he can react, he's transported to a dense forest. Initially panicked, Mark tries to stay calm, realizing that what's happening is real, not a hallucination, far beyond anything he's experienced before. Meanwhile, Memo visits the record store, hoping to find Thomas, but he's nowhere to be found. Concerned, Memo sends a voice memo to the house phone, informing him that Thomas has disappeared. Across town, Petra is preparing for a date when she listens to the message. She changes her plans and heads to the police station to file a missing person report for Thomas. At the same time, Becky strikes a deal with Sarah. She agrees to do Sarah's homework in exchange for information about Mark. Sarah reveals a dark secret from Mark's past, telling Becky that Mark's father had once kidnapped his children and later set himself on fire on Mark's own birthday. The revelation leaves Becky with even more questions and a deeper intrigue about Mark's troubled history. Mark is attacked while wandering in the forest, only to realize the attacker is his brother Thomas. Relieved, they embrace. That evening, Thomas explains where they are, noting the absence of the moon or stars, and shares his plan to kill the Gryphon, ruler of the Black Tower. Mark, however, is more focused on getting home. Mark reveals that he didn't use the church portal but was transported by simply looking at the book. Shocked, Thomas insists they discuss it tomorrow, avoiding further explanation, leaving Mark with lingering questions. Becky and Sarah have another heated disagreement after Ben refuses to give Becky a ride to see Mark. Sarah's dismissive attitude irritates Becky, who stands her ground, telling Sarah that true friendship is built on mutual respect. Frustrated, Becky walks away, ignoring Sarah's insult. Determined to find Mark, Becky heads to the record store where Memo tells her it's Mark's shift, but he hasn't shown up. Hesitant to leave a private message, Memo reassures her she can leave it at the desk. Meanwhile, Mark and Thomas are running away from slave hunters. Thomas is caught, and just as things seem hopeless, Mark is suddenly transported back to the record store. Confused, he accidentally injures Becky, who's there with Memo. Concerned, they ask what's happening, and Mark decides it's time to reveal the truth. Elsewhere in the Black Black Tower, a slave hunter reports capturing Thomas. Their master calmly assures the hunter that their father will soon come, ready to join them. Memo and Becky struggle to believe Mark's strange story. While Becky is sympathetic, Memo remains confused. Determined to prove himself, Mark takes them to the church, but nothing unusual happens on the rooftop. Disappointed, both begin to doubt his health. Mark watches as they leave him behind. In anger, Mark kicks a stone statue, triggering destruction in the Black Tower. Meanwhile, Mark reassures his worried mother, but feels compelled to find Thomas. Returning to the church, he kicks the statue again, and to his shock, it speaks, revealing it's Mark's brother who is trapped, and the statue reveals that he is only stone. Mark convinces Memo to help, and they uncover a portal at the church. Inside, Memo's eye vision is cleared, and his injured leg heals. But as they explore the realm, the gate closes and Mark disappears, leaving Memo trapped and confused. Mark rushed to his room, panic rising as he remembered leaving Memo at the Black Tower. Desperate, he reached for the Chronicle to return, but before he could, his mother walked in. She asked about Thomas, and Mark, thinking fast, lied that he'd met with him and would call her tomorrow. His mother, unconvinced, noticed the Chronicle on his bed, suspicion growing. Without a word, she locked the door, trapping Mark inside. Furious, Mark fumed as chaos spread further in the Black Tower. Patris received a call from Mark's mother, who told him she had locked Mark in his room after finding the Chronicle. She mentioned that Mark claimed it came from Thomas, which unsettled her. Patris disagreed with her actions, urging her to let Mark out and reassuring her that Mark wasn't like his father, Carl. Reluctantly, she unlocked the door. Once free, Mark wasted no time. He rushed back to where Memo was, retraced his steps to open the gate as before, quickly grabbed a note Memo had left and returned just before the gate closed. Mark gathered various resources and went to see Becky, intending to hand over the Chronicle. As he began explaining and apologizing for his past mistakes, Becky unexpectedly kissed him, strengthening their bond. Though hesitant about the Chronicle, she eventually took it. Mark told her that Memo was trapped in the Black Tower and urged her to follow his detailed instructions to open the portal. Despite her doubts, she agreed to help. Meanwhile, Sarah warned Becky that Mark might be struggling with mental issues and suggested she distance herself. Becky, however, dismissed Sarah's concerns, deciding to investigate further. Later, Mark found himself in an unfamiliar location controlled by slave hunters. With a plan in mind, he played music to distract the hunters. Among the prisoners at the Black Tower were others captured by the hunters. As the leader tormented the captives, he ordered a brave young man who had volunteered to save his family to be taken to his father. Becky and Sarah were at the Schloss Park Cinema when Becky decided to show Sarah the Chronicle book. She flipped through the pages, revealing strange details about the monster plant and other eerie sections of the book. Unsettled, Sarah felt uneasy and insisted they should tell Mark's mother about the whole thing. But Becky managed to convince her to hold off and uncover the truth themselves, promising Sarah that she would close the matter once they got to the bottom of it. Meanwhile, the young man who had volunteered to save his family was cleaned up by the slave hunters and given fresh clothes. Afterward, they made him sit on a wooden chair. Without warning, a Gryphon stung him from behind, causing his voice to change unnaturally. It became clear that the Gryphon was attempting to control or influence his thoughts. The slave hunters closed in on Mark, but just before they could capture him, a masked man appeared. He smeared dead fish on Mark and the trees, masking his scent, and guided him to safety deep in the forest. Meanwhile, Becky, Sarah, and Ben struggled with the Chronicle. Growing frustrated, Becky tried dropping water on a flower, and unintentionally, Ben placed the image into a glass of water. In the forest, Mark realized the masked man was Memo. They discovered that while only a day passed for Mark, Memo had been trapped for 3 weeks. Mark and Ben spotted a group of humans being brutally enslaved by the slave hunters. Memo, enraged, wanted to help Thomas, but Mark held him back, reminding him they were unarmed. As they debated, a hunter noticed them, forcing them to run. Trapped at the top of a mountain, Mark recalled his father's words, "The bravest is the one who chooses not to fight." With no other option, they leaped from the mountaintop and miraculously landed safely in Mark's room. Meanwhile, Becky and her classmates visited Martin's church, trying to follow the Chronicle's instructions but failed to open the gate. As they left, the police caught them. Back in Mark's room, he and Memo's relief was short-lived as Petra arrived, insisting they meet Memo's father. Elsewhere, the flower in Ben's water glass began to bloom ominously, growing in a disturbing, unnatural way. Mark and Memo are devising a strategy to free Thomas from the slave hunters. Memo, being more experienced, guides Mark by pointing out the location of the water source on a map. He also informs Mark that he's constructed a cabin nearby. Memo further explains that the hunters regularly stop by the water source before transporting their captives to the mines. This key detail gives them an opportunity to rescue Thomas during one of these stops. The master of the slave hunters delivers a message to his father, the boss who oversees all operations, revealing that some travelers between worlds attempted to free his brother. The father, displeased with this failure, ends the leader's life by placing his hand on his head and then appoints a new leader, Demia, to take charge. Meanwhile, Becky is in her room when she notices a flower has bloomed. Her father enters and tells her he spoke to the police on her behalf, explaining she was remorseful and sternly advises her not to get involved in such matters again. Becky, however, insists that Mark has uncovered something genuine, but her father dismisses this, suggesting Mark is unwell. He comforts her by saying she can still be with him. As this unfolds, Becky pulls out the chronicle book hidden under her bed, unaware of the strange creatures lurking nearby. She ends up handing the chronicle over to her father. Mark begins to doubt the plan he and Memo have come up with, but Memo reassures him, insisting they don't need assistance from any adults or the police, reminding Mark that there's no one they can truly trust. Later at school, Mark meets Becky, but her attitude is different from before. She vaguely tells him that he can retrieve something from her father, leaving Mark puzzled. When he asks what's going on, she abruptly tells him that they need to go their separate ways. Mark pushes for an explanation, and after some hesitation, Becky coldly tells him that he's mentally unstable and that staying with him would only make things worse. Meanwhile, Ben goes to pick up the sound system he rented, only to find out the owner has already given it to someone else, because Ben arrived late. Frustrated, Ben lashes out at Sarah, blaming her for his tardiness. Maya, another classmate, steps in and reveals that she had rented the sound system earlier, which unexpectedly lifts Ben's mood. Petra visits Mark's mother, expressing concern that Mark's condition is more severe than she realizes. He explains that Mark has become convinced that everything written in his father's chronicle is real, and he's worried Mark could end up hurting himself. Mark's mother, shaken, tells Petra that she can't bear to lose him too, not after what happened to both his father and Thomas. On the other side, Ben confronts Sarah, telling her he's been sacrificing for her but feels abandoned when he needs her most. In an attempt to soothe the tension, Sarah kisses him, but the moment doesn't sit well with Maya, who watches the scene unfold. Meanwhile, Petra becomes increasingly anxious about Mark's situation and calls a psychiatrist to intervene. When they try to apprehend Mark, he manages to escape their grip and flees to a church. Despite their efforts to catch up, both Mark and Memo are overpowered and pinned to the ground by the psychiatrist team. Suddenly, a mysterious figure appears and fights off the entire team, allowing Mark and Memo to escape toward the Black Tower. Outside, Petra witnesses something unsettling. She spots what appears to be Mark, but quickly realizes it's not the real him. There are two Marks. Later, Petrus delivers the grim news about Mark to his daughter, informing her that Mark has killed someone. He forbids her from using her phone or TV, saying it's for her own good. Though she struggles to believe it, she reluctantly complies with her father's orders. Petrus then personally visits the crime scene, where he finds Petra overwhelmed with sadness and grief. Meanwhile, Becky, feeling isolated, drowns her loneliness by blasting music through her headphones as she lies on the floor, trying to escape her thoughts. At the Black Tower, night falls, and Memo observes that Mark has feelings for Becky. Just then, a sudden rainstorm begins, which puts Memo on high alert. He urgently tells Mark to run, but Mark, confused, sees only the rain. Memo quickly points out strange flowers emerging, and from these flowers hatch bizarre, spider-like creatures. The two of them sprint up the mountain to escape. Becky, however, faces a similar terror. One of the unknown creatures forces its way into her mouth, but she manages to yank it out and throw it into the trash. Not taking any chances, she pours salt over it, watching as the spider-like creature dies. Becky stumbles upon the chronicle once again and discovers a letter that Mark had written earlier. Realizing its importance, she immediately calls Ben and Sarah. When they arrive, Becky doesn't waste time with details and simply tells them that they need to head to Mark's mother's house without delay. Meanwhile, Mark is frustrated with Memo for keeping him in the dark about the strange flowers. When they reach the lake, Memo dives in for a swim to cool off, and despite his anger, Mark eventually follows suit, joining him in the water. Elsewhere, Petrus returns home and heads to the backyard. He removes his blood-stained clothes, the same ones from the night he killed the psychiatrist at the church. He burns the clothing, erasing any evidence of his involvement in the crime. Afterward, a scary face creature appears in front of Gryphon, reassuring him that the boy will never return to the human world. The creature confirms that everything is progressing according to their plan. Back at the Black Tower, Mark is astonished by what Memo has managed to accomplish. Memo has constructed a small hut for shelter, preparing for the upcoming battle. They set up different tools near the lake, using various tools they've gathered to confront the slave hunters and rescue Thomas. Meanwhile, Becky is trying to convince Petra that the Black Tower is real. She explains the details she uncovered from the Chronicle, warning that Gryphon is manipulating people, but Petra remains skeptical. As Becky shares information about Martin Zimmerman and the family's biological ancestry, Petra grows increasingly frustrated, dismissing it all as nonsense. Their conversation is interrupted when a detective arrives at Petra's house to conduct further investigation. Suddenly, Becky remembers that she left her backpack, which contains the vital Chronicle, in Ben's car. Realizing its importance, panic starts to set in. Sarah's family finds out that she sneaked out to attend a party, defying the rules of the church. In response, her father banned her from seeing Ben. Meanwhile, Ben is outside, waiting for her. When Sarah is late, he decides to go to her house, but her mother lies, telling him that Sarah has changed her mind about going out with him. That evening, Mark and Memo are having a smooth conversation at the lake. Memo offers Mark a smoke from a flower, and as Mark unwinds, he doesn't notice a mosquito landing on him. The mosquito takes a small amount of his blood and flies off, delivering it to the strange creature who reports Mark's movements back to their father, Gryphon. The creature reveals that Mark and Memo have built a hideout and plan to follow the hunters to free Thomas. Gryphon, not wanting any complications, commands that this issue be handled swiftly. The next morning, Mark wakes up to find his bag empty, leaving him confused. He asks Memo if he touched his things, but Memo denies it. Then, Mark notices Memo by the lake, seemingly talking to the fish. Becky meets up with Sarah, who reveals that she's planning to sneak out to the party despite being banned from leaving the house. Sarah also admits she never gave Ben the keys to the movie theater, making him believe she ditched him again. Sarah then informs Becky that her backpack was left in Ben's car. Meanwhile, Ben, frustrated and rebellious, breaks into the movie theater with his friends. At the same time, Mark starts to piece together what he had previously teleported using the Chronicle book. He concludes that fear is the trigger for teleportation, but he struggles to figure out what could cause the necessary fear. He attempts to teleport again, but fails. Later, Mark sees his mother talking with Memo, but strangely, Memo doesn't seem to recognize her or anyone else around. A mysterious figure from the Black Tower visits Peters, informing him that Mark Zimmerman has been spotted at the mountain lake. Peters, however, remains calm, confident that his plan is unfolding just as intended. But when Peters goes to check on Becky in her bedroom, she's missing. Acting quickly, Peters collects dust and hair particles from her room and uses them to discover her recent activities. As he heads to his car, he transforms, turning into the same strange creature seen at the Black Tower. Mark finally discovers the key to teleporting between the real world and the Black Tower. He realizes it's not fear that triggers the teleportation, but rather a focused mindset on a single thought or emotion, making the process work regardless of what he's feeling. Meanwhile, Becky, along with Petra and the detective, heads to Schloss Park Cinema. There, Becky finds Ben, who is furious with Sarah, and, in his drunken state, impulsively kisses Becky. This only angers Becky, and Maya snaps a picture of the kiss at just the wrong moment. In the chaos, Becky notices the Chronicle book has been soaked in beer, and to her horror, One of the monster flowers has released a creature. Determined, Becky grabs some salt and starts searching for the same spider-like creature that had attacked her before. At the Black Tower, Mark encounters his father in the flesh. His father grabs Mark's hand, burning it with intense heat. Mark screams, and Memo rushes to him, but to Memo's eyes, no one else is there. Memo believes Mark is trapped in a nightmare, even as Mark desperately tries to explain what just happened. Overwhelmed with frustration and confusion, Mark returns to their hut, where, in a moment of madness, he injures himself by tightly gripping the nails embedded in the structure. At the party, just as Ben is about to kiss Maya, she is suddenly snatched away by one of the unknown spider-like creatures. On the other side of the event, Becky is stopped in her tracks by her own father, who uses hypnosis to control her. Chaos ensues when the spider-like creature wreaks havoc at the party, causing panic. The detective attempts to confront the creature, shouting at it, but the creature easily overpowers him and is about to deliver a fatal blow. Just in time, Petra grabs a gun and shoots the creature, killing it. However, as the creature dies, it bizarrely transforms into beer, spilling across the ground. Meanwhile, at the Black Tower, Mark is disturbed by the constant noise of the fish while Memo hunts them. Tensions rise, and Mark argues with Memo. Frustrated and looking for a way to calm his anger, Mark reaches for the nails he usually uses, only to find them gone. In a panic, he confronts Memo, who casually reveals the nail and throws it into the lake. Memo then starts blaming Mark for everything that has gone wrong, repeatedly accusing him of being responsible for his father's death. Anger boils over, and Mark snaps, kicking Memo in the face. The Black Tower trembles with the impact, and Gryphon, sensing the disturbance, issues a command for the hunters to track down and capture Mark. Memo encounters Markin and a duplicate version of himself falling downwards. When Memo reaches out to touch his double, it crumbles into the sand and vanishes. However, Memo manages to grab Markin by flinging some nearby troops at him. They tie him to the stone chair, and just as he's about to be fired, the creature with them begins to speak. It reveals the truth about the Gryphon, but before that, it had been trying to confuse them by changing into both Mark's and Memo's fathers. As they process this, an alarm sounds, warning them that slave hunters are approaching. They quickly escape, untying the creature in the process. At the gathering, the police are already on the scene, with detective teams busy at work. The owner of the bear is insisting to the officers that the animal is not dangerous, explaining that they have taken strict precautions. At the same time, a detective pulls Petra aside, revealing that he witnessed Carl burn right in front of him. However, he mentions that they couldn't recover Carl's remains, not even ashes, bones, or teeth, which was highly unusual. He adds that the case has been hushed up by the public prosecutor. The detective also shares that he saw a strange creature at the police station and informs her that the entire investigation has been abruptly dropped, leaving Petra confused and uncertain. Becky regains consciousness as her father, Peters, turns on the TV to show her the events unfolding at the Schloss Park cinema. The news reports claim that a bear is attacking people, but Becky insists that what she saw was a terrifying creature. Frustrated, her father snaps and, without thinking, blurts out the name the Great Eagle before locking her in her room. Meanwhile, Memo and Mark are tailing the slave hunters as part of their plan, knowing the hunters will camp out for the night. During their pursuit, Memo mentions to Mark that he had once smashed his head. Mark calmly responds that it wasn't the real Mark, leading to a light-hearted exchange that strengthens their resolve for the upcoming battle with the hunters. On the other side, two of the slave hunters develop a bond, showing an unexpected connection, almost like real humans. The following day, Memo and Mark continue trailing the slave hunters from a safe distance. As they observe the scene, Memo's hope begins to fade. He notices the workers in the mines all wearing identical clothing, making it nearly impossible to pick Thomas out from the crowd. The realization leaves him feeling discouraged, unsure how they'll manage to find him. The leader of the slave hunters reports to the mine overseer that the world traveler is no longer at the lake. In response, the overseer insists they need to inform the Gryphon. However, the slave hunter suggests that the boy may still be nearby, possibly tracking them. Impressed by the hunter's sharp thinking, the mine overseer orders him to prepare the tunnels with tur mud, recognizing that this one is far more intelligent than the others. Suddenly, loud music blares from an unknown source, throwing the entire squad of slave hunters, including their leader, into confusion. In the midst of the chaos, Thomas reveals himself, stepping out and gesturing to indicate his presence. However, before he can make a move, one of the slave hunters sneaks up from behind and takes him down with a swift kick. Thomas is quickly dragged into the mines, leaving his brief moment of defiance cut short. That evening, as most of the slave hunters fall asleep, Mark and Memo prepare to execute their plan. Memo starts by throwing stones at the hunters, creating a distraction to lure them away in an attempt to catch him. Meanwhile, on the other side, Mark teleports to Thomas's location. He begins untying Thomas, but just as they're about to make their escape, they find themselves trapped in the mine. To make matters worse, Mark is unable to teleport while holding on to Thomas, leaving them both stuck and vulnerable. Thomas explains that the tur mud, which they are surrounded by, is the reason Mark's powers have weakened. However, Thomas gives Mark a large amount of it, explaining that it can be used against the Gryphon in their upcoming battle. He also reveals that if the Gryphon wins, he will gain the ability to control other worlds through travel. Meanwhile, Ben and his friends are at the hospital, where the doctor delivers devastating news about Maya. They are told her brain is irreparably damaged, and they are granted to visit to see her, leaving everyone heartbroken. Back in the mine, Mark uses his remaining superior strength to break through the cave walls, allowing him and his brother to escape. This infuriates the mine leader, who realizes he has lost control of the situation. At the same time, Memo finds himself being hunted by the slave hunters. He tries to defend himself, but is overpowered and severely injured, losing some of his fingers in the fight. As Mark and Thomas discuss their next steps, a slave hunter sneaks up to attack. Just in time, Memo calls out to Mark, who quickly reacts and kills the attacker using the lot. However, Memo is gravely injured, suffering from both his wounds and a fever. Sarah comes across an old photo Maya had taken, showing Ben kissing her, which leaves Sarah feeling hurt and conflicted. Meanwhile, the Gryphon emerges from its hiding place, a massive, terrifying creature that strikes fear into everyone, including the slave hunters. Elsewhere, Mark and Thomas begin arguing over the lot. Their disagreement escalates until Thomas lands a kick to Mark's face, knocking him down. Thomas then tries to open the gate but struggles, only to look up and see the Gryphon flying above them. Mark regains consciousness and quickly realizes that Thomas has been captured by the Gryphon. The creature challenges Mark to a fight, aiming to take his power. Though filled with rage, Mark suddenly remembers his father's advice and refuses to engage in battle with the Gryphon. At the same time, Becky, Petra, and the detective are working together to open the gate. Eventually, Petra succeeds in unlocking it. Becky then helps Memo reach the gate while Mark, now wielding the lot, attacks the Gryphon. His assault forces the Gryphon to release Thomas, and soon they all manage to escape the Black Tower. Meanwhile, Dr. Peters is killed by another man who steps in to take over his work on Earth. On the other side, Petra tearfully apologizes to her children, admitting that she stole precious years from their lives to try to understand them. She promises that from now on, she'll be there for them whenever they need her. The movie ends with Mark returning to his normal life. At school, he receives a picture of Becky kissing Ben, which enrages him. He nearly attempts to harm himself, but stops. Later, he visits Becky's house, kisses her, and suddenly vanishes, reappearing in the Black Tower. Meanwhile, Ben uses a portal to bring Maya to the tower, leaving the story in suspense.